Cordelia Blackwood had always known her mother-in-law Beatrice was controlling, but she never imagined the depths of her manipulation until 2 months after her husband, Marcus's funeral. Standing in her kitchen at midnight, feeding her 3-month-old son, Oliver, Cordelia stared at the court documents that had been slipped under her door. Papers claiming she was mentally unstable and requesting emergency custody of her baby. Petitioner states that the biological mother shows signs of severe postpartum depression and is unable to provide adequate care for the minor child. Cordelia read aloud, her voice trembling. "This is insane." The signature at the bottom made her blood run cold. Beatrice Blackwood, maternal grandmother, requesting immediate custody due to concerns for the child's safety and well-being. Cordelia had been grieving her husband's sudden heart attack at 32, trying to navigate new motherhood alone while dealing with her own overwhelming loss. She'd been emotional, yes, but she'd never been unfit. She'd been taking care of Oliver perfectly well, with help from her own mother and close friends. But Beatrice had been watching, waiting, and documenting everything. The older woman had been visiting daily under the guise of helping with the baby, insisting that Cordelia needed to rest while she handled Oliver's care. She'd been taking photographs of Cordelia during her most vulnerable moments, crying while holding Oliver, looking exhausted after sleepless nights, struggling to balance household tasks with caring for a newborn. What Beatrice didn't know was that Cordelia Blackwood wasn't just any grieving widow. She was a family court judge who specialized in custody cases, and she'd been on temporary leave following her husband's death. She knew exactly how custody battles worked, and she recognized a manufactured case when she saw one. "She's been planning this since Marcus died," Cordelia realized, scanning through the fabricated evidence. "She thinks she can steal my baby." The documents were sophisticated, too sophisticated for Beatrice to have created alone. There were psychological evaluations from a doctor Cordelia had never met, claiming she'd been treated for severe depression and anxiety. Social worker reports describing a home environment that was chaotic and unsuitable for childcare. Even photographs that had been taken without her consent, showing her at her most exhausted and vulnerable. But the most damning piece was an audio recording where Cordelia allegedly confessed to feeling unable to cope and wanting to give up. As a family court judge, Cordelia recognized the editing techniques immediately. Beatrice had recorded their conversations during her daily visits, then spliced together sentences to create a false confession. That night, Cordelia sat in her home office, surrounded by legal textbooks and case files. She'd been presiding over custody disputes for 8 years, and she'd seen every trick in the book. But this was personal, and Beatrice had underestimated exactly who she was dealing with. As a family court judge, Cordelia had access to resources that most parents in custody battles could only dream of. She knew every social worker, every court-appointed psychologist, and every family attorney in the county. More importantly, she knew how to investigate fraud in family court proceedings. The breakthrough came when Cordelia discovered the name of the social worker who'd filed the report against her, Patricia Vance. Cordelia had never heard of her, which was suspicious since she knew every social worker in the county system. A quick background check revealed that Patricia Vance had been hired by a private agency just 1 month ago, and her only previous experience was as Beatrice's personal assistant. She hired her own employee to pose as a social worker, Cordelia said, printing out that evidence. "This is criminal fraud." But Cordelia didn't stop there. She began investigating Beatrice's finances, using her judicial access to court records. What she found was staggering. Beatrice had been liquidating her assets, preparing to flee the state with Oliver once she gained custody. She'd already enrolled him in a private school in Florida, using a fake birth certificate that listed her as his mother. The smoking gun came when Cordelia discovered Beatrice's correspondence with the fake psychologist. The emails revealed the entire conspiracy, how Beatrice had paid Dr. Mitchell Stevens $10,000 to create a false psychological evaluation, how she'd bribed Patricia Vance to pose as a social worker, and how she'd been secretly drugging Cordelia's tea with mild sedatives to make her appear more unstable during their visits. She's been poisoning me to make me look incompetent, Cordelia realized, her hands shaking as she read the emails. She's been planning to kidnap my son. The most horrifying discovery was Beatrice's backup plan. If the custody case failed, she'd arranged for Oliver to be accidentally injured during one of her visits, then claimed that Cordelia had been negligent. She'd already prepared fake medical records and arranged for a corrupt doctor to support her claims. On the day of the emergency custody hearing, Cordelia arrived not as a defendant, but as a judge reclaiming her position. She coordinated with the State Attorney General's office and the FBI's Criminal Division. Beatrice's confidence evaporated the moment she saw the federal agents enter the courtroom. "Mrs. Blackwood," the lead FBI agent said, addressing Beatrice, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit kidnapping, fraud, bribery, and child endangerment." Beatrice's face went pale as she watched handcuffs being placed on her wrists. "This is ridiculous. Cordelia, tell them this is all a misunderstanding. I was trying to help you." Cordelia stood up, her judicial robes restored, her voice steady and authoritative. "The only misunderstanding here is yours, Beatrice. You thought you were dealing with a helpless, grieving mother, but what you actually did was commit federal crimes against a sitting family court judge who specializes in exactly the kind of fraud you've been perpetrating." The evidence was overwhelming. Beatrice's emails, the payments to fake professionals, the forged documents, and the drugging scheme all painted a clear picture of a calculated conspiracy to steal a child. But Cordelia had one more surprise. "Your Honor," Cordelia said, addressing the presiding judge, "I'd like to present evidence that Mrs. Blackwood has attempted this scheme before." Beatrice's eyes widened in terror as Cordelia revealed her investigation into Beatrice's background. This wasn't her first attempt to steal a grandchild. She'd tried similar tactics with her daughter-in-law from her first marriage, but that woman had fled the state with her children before Beatrice could complete her plan. The judge's expression hardened as Cordelia presented evidence of Beatrice's previous attempts to manipulate custody cases, including her history of bribing social workers and creating false evidence against other family members. "Mrs. Blackwood," the judge said sternly, "given the severity of these charges and your apparent history of similar schemes, I'm denying your custody petition and ordering a full investigation into your previous activities." Beatrice broke down completely, her carefully constructed facade crumbling. "Cordelia, please. Oliver needs his grandmother. I can give him things you can't. I have money, stability, experience with children." But Cordelia felt no sympathy. "You tried to steal my son. You drugged me in my own home. You created an entire criminal conspiracy to convince the world I was an unfit mother. You don't get to talk about what's best for Oliver." The trial lasted 5 months and became a landmark case in family court fraud. Beatrice was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Her co-conspirators, the fake social worker, the corrupt psychologist, and the bribed officials, all received significant sentences. But the real victory came when Cordelia's investigation led to widespread reforms in the family court system. New protocols were implemented to verify the credentials of social workers and psychologists, and stricter penalties were established for those who attempted to manipulate custody proceedings. Cordelia not only kept her son, but also received commendations from the state Supreme Court for exposing systematic corruption in the family court system. She used her experience to establish new training programs for judges and social workers to help them identify fraudulent custody cases. 18 months after Beatrice's conviction, Cordelia stood in her restored courtroom, Oliver playing quietly in her chambers during her lunch break. She'd returned to her position as family court judge, but now she had a personal understanding of how vulnerable parents could be manipulated by those who abused the system. "I'm sorry you'll grow up without knowing your father," Cordelia whispered to Oliver as he played with his toys, "but I made sure you'll never have to fear someone trying to steal you from the people who truly love you." Beatrice had thought she was clever, using her wealth and connections to manipulate the family court system, but she'd made the fatal mistake of targeting the wrong family. Cordelia's husband had raised her to be strong and principled, and her legal training had given her the tools to fight back. As the sun set over the courthouse, Cordelia realized that her greatest victory wasn't keeping her son, it was the systemic changes she'd implemented to protect other families from similar attacks. Her case had exposed corruption in the family court system and led to reforms that would protect children for generations. Beatrice was serving 12 years in federal prison, her assets seized to pay for her victims' legal fees. She'd spent years building her network of corrupt professionals, and it had all come crashing down because she'd underestimated one grieving mother who refused to let her child be stolen. The fake social worker, corrupt psychologist, and bribed officials had all been exposed and prosecuted. The private agency that had employed Patricia Vance was shut down, and new regulations were implemented to prevent similar schemes. But the most satisfying moment came when Cordelia received a letter from another mother, named Iris, who'd been inspired by her case to fight back against her own manipulative mother-in-law. "Because of your courage," Iris wrote, "I recognized the signs when my mother-in-law tried to have me declared unfit. I was able to expose her scheme before she could take my daughter. You didn't just save your own family, you saved mine too." Cordelia framed the letter and hung it in her office, next to the photograph of her late husband and the first picture of Oliver after his birth. Marcus would have been proud to see how she protected their son and helped other families in the process. As she tucked Oliver into his crib that night, Cordelia reflected on how her husband's memory had given her the strength to fight. He taught her that family was sacred, and that lesson had guided her through the darkest period of her life. Beatrice had thought she was dealing with a vulnerable widow who would be too grief-stricken to fight back effectively. Instead, she'd encountered a skilled judge who'd spent years learning how to protect families from exactly the kind of predatory behavior she'd exhibited. The case had changed everything, not just for Cordelia and Oliver, but for the entire family court system. New safeguards were in place to prevent fraudulent custody cases, and a new generation of judges had been trained to recognize the signs of manipulation and abuse. Years later, when law schools taught courses on family court corruption, they would use Cordelia's case as the perfect example of how one person's expertise and determination could expose an entire network of fraud. She'd proven that justice wasn't just about following the law, it was about protecting the most vulnerable members of society, one family at a time.